Sign it or leave my house. That's what my son said to me at Christmas dinner. His voice was cold, and everyone at the table went silent. I tried to laugh it off, to tell him not to joke like that. But then he pushed me. Hard. I hit the floor in front of my whole family. No one helped, not even him. That night, while they slept, I opened my husband's old safe, the one he told me never to forget. Inside was a single envelope, his handwriting, his plan, a secret clause that could change everything. I realized in that moment he thought he'd taken my home, but he had no idea what I was about to do next. So, stay with me. You're going to want to hear what happened the next morning, and if you've ever been betrayed by your own family, you'll understand. They thought they buried me under the table. They forgot I built the house. My name is Vivian Carter, and I'm 70 years old. I've lived in this house by the Ashley River for most of my life. My husband, Frank, built it with his own hands when we were young and foolish enough to think hard work could protect us from heartbreak. For 40 years, every Christmas dinner was held here, at this same long table with its polished oak and red roses. Frank used to call the chair at the head of the table the rose seat. It was his once, and then it became mine. This year was different. The house was dressed for Christmas, garlands, candles, the smell of pine and roasted turkey, but the warmth didn't reach the people sitting around the table. Everyone smiled too much, spoke too carefully, and laughed too quickly. It felt rehearsed, not real. My son Ryan stood up first. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, the kind of confident man Frank always hoped he'd become. He raised his glass and said, "It's time for a new era." Everyone clapped politely, but no one seemed to know what that meant. My daughter-in-law, Sabrina, smiled her perfect smile and placed her hand on his arm. "Carter & Co. will finally have a modern vision," she said like she was reading from a press release. I smiled back at them, even though I felt the air in the room turn cold. "Vision without roots is vanity," I said. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a few awkward laughs broke the silence. The only genuine smile came from my granddaughter, Grace. She's 16 and always glued to her phone. She was recording a video saying she wanted to keep Christmas memories. I didn't know then that her little video would become the most important thing that night. Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He laid it on the table in front of me. "Mom," he said softly, "we just need your signature. It's nothing big. Just formalities." I looked down at the envelope and already knew what it was. But I opened it anyway and went straight to the last page. I saw the words printed clearly at the bottom. Transfer of ownership. I looked up and said, "You forgot who taught you to write?" His jaw tightened. "Don't make a scene, Mom." "Then don't make a fool of your father's name," I said. The tension in the room grew thick. I could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock near the fireplace. Frank bought that clock the year Ryan was born, and it had never stopped working. Neither had I. Ryan's face was red now. "This isn't how we wanted to do this," he said. I stood up slowly. "Then maybe you should have thought twice before trying." He stepped toward me, his voice low. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "I'm not the one doing this," I replied. "You are." The next few seconds are something I'll never forget. He put his hand on the back of my chair and pushed. Maybe he didn't mean for me to fall. Maybe he did. But I lost my balance, and before I knew it, the world spun sideways. My hip hit the floor hard. My wine glass shattered beside me, the red spreading across the white marble like blood. For a moment, no one moved. Sabrina pressed her hand to her mouth, pretending to be shocked, but I saw the look in her eyes, calm, satisfied, almost proud. Grace screamed and ran to me. Her phone was still recording, the red light blinking. Ryan froze. He didn't reach for me. He didn't say a word, just stood there looking down like he didn't recognize the woman on the floor. My son. My only child. I heard someone in the background, maybe one of the staff, whisper, "Should we call someone?" I said no before Ryan could open his mouth. My voice came out steady, colder than I expected. "No, no one." Grace helped me up. My body hurt, but I didn't show it. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I fixed my dress, straightened my back, and looked around the room. Everyone avoided my eyes. No one said they were sorry. Not even Ryan. I took the phone from Grace's shaking hand and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Keep this safe." Sabrina's face twitched. That was when I knew she understood exactly what I meant. I left the dining room without another word. My footsteps echoed up the grand staircase. Each step sent a sharp pain through my hip, but I kept walking. The house that had once felt warm now felt hollow. When I reached my bedroom, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it for a long moment. The silence in that room was heavy. I could still hear the faint sound of laughter downstairs, forced and uneasy, as if nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my shaking hands. Then I noticed Grace's phone still clutched between my fingers. The red recording light was still blinking. I pressed stop and watched the last few seconds of the video. I saw my own face, confused and hurt. I saw Ryan's expression, hard and distant. I saw Sabrina's smile, the tiny curl of victory at the corner of her mouth. It was all there, every second. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling something inside me shift. I thought of Frank, of the nights he spent planning, building, and protecting what we created. He always said, "Vivian, people change when they think they're untouchable. Make sure they never forget who gave them that power." That night, I realized he'd been right. I opened the small drawer of my bedside table and took out my own phone. I saved the video twice, once to the cloud, once to an external drive. I made sure every copy was backed up. Then I looked out the window at the quiet river, dark under the moonlight. "They think they buried me tonight," I whispered. "They forgot who built this house." My reflection in the glass didn't look like the woman I was a few hours ago. The mother, the grandmother, the soft one. She was gone. What was left was something colder, quieter, steadier. Downstairs, I could hear Ryan's voice muffled through the walls. He was telling Sabrina to calm down. He said it was just a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. He didn't understand anything yet. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about Frank's study, the one no one was allowed to touch after he passed. I remembered the safe he'd had built into the wall behind his old painting. I hadn't opened it in years. That thought stayed with me as the clock struck midnight. I couldn't sleep. The pain in my hip pulsed with every heartbeat, but the real ache was somewhere deeper, the kind that only betrayal can cause. I knew I had to see what was in that safe. Frank never kept secrets from me, but before he died, he told me something strange. He said, "If Ryan ever tries to take what we built, don't argue, just open the safe." I thought it was a joke. Now I wasn't so sure. I lay awake until the first light crept through the curtains. My mind kept replaying the moment, Ryan's hand on my shoulder, the shock, the sound of the glass breaking. Grace's scream, Sabrina's eyes. When I finally stood, I looked at the phone again. The red dot on the screen wasn't just a symbol of what happened. It was proof. Real, solid proof. The camera doesn't lie. But I wondered, who would believe an old woman? Still, I knew one thing for certain. They had started something they couldn't control, and I was going to finish it. When I woke up the next morning, the house was silent. My back ached, my hip felt bruised, and every small movement reminded me of what had happened the night before. I don't remember calling anyone, but the family doctor must have come early. He examined me quietly, said it was just a bad fall, and left just as quickly. I could tell he didn't want to get involved. In this house, silence had always been safer than truth. A little later, Sabrina knocked on my door. She came in holding a tray, tea, toast, and a small bottle of painkillers. Her voice was soft, almost kind, but there was something underneath it that felt sharp. "You need rest, Mom," she said. "Ryan didn't mean it. He's just under so much pressure right now." I watched her set the tray down on my bedside table like she owned the place. I didn't say anything. She gave me that polished smile again, the kind she used with investors and reporters. Then she turned and walked out without waiting for a response. The door clicked shut, and I was alone again. The silence in the house felt heavier than before. Every sound seemed to echo. The creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs, even the faint ticking of the old clock. I got out of bed slowly, using the dresser for balance, and walked to the hallway. The walls looked strange. Then I saw it. The framed photographs that had lined the corridor for years were gone. All of them. The picture of Frank holding Ryan as a baby, the one of me and Grace baking cookies, even our wedding photo. Only empty hooks were left behind. They had erased me. I stood there for a long time, looking at those blank spaces. The air smelled of furniture polish and cold marble. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a tomb. I picked up the phone and called Daniel Harlow, Frank's old friend and our family lawyer. He answered on the second ring. His voice was warm, steady, and serious, just as I remembered. "Vivian," he said, "I heard something happened last night. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I told him. "But, Daniel, they've started. Just like Frank said they would." There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "Frank predicted they would. He told me if this day ever came, you'd know what to do." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Do you remember the founder's clause in his will?" "I remember he mentioned it once years ago, but he never explained." "That's because it wasn't meant to be explained," Daniel said. "It was meant to be found. Frank built it into his final trust agreement. It only activates if you are wronged, publicly, provably wronged, by anyone in the line of inheritance." His words hung in the air. My heart started to beat faster. "So what does that mean for me?" "It means," he said carefully, "that Frank made sure you'd never lose what's yours, but you'll have to find his instructions. They won't be obvious." I thanked him, though my hands were trembling. After the call, I walked slowly to Frank's old study. The door hadn't been opened in months. Dust floated in the air like smoke when I pushed it open. His scent, a mix of cedar, ink, and aftershave, still lingered. I could almost hear his voice, steady and reassuring, telling me not to be afraid. The safe was behind a painting of the river, the one he loved most. I stood there for a while before I finally pulled the frame aside. The metal door was cold to the touch. I turned the dial, the numbers coming back to me like a song I hadn't sung in years. When the lock clicked open, something inside me did too. Inside the safe were a few familiar things: our marriage certificate, old company documents, and a stack of yellowing letters tied with twine. But what caught my eye was a small wooden box. I lifted it out carefully and set it on the desk. It was lighter than I expected. Inside was one single coin, a silver dollar, worn smooth from years of handling. I recognized it immediately. Frank's lucky coin. He used to keep it in his pocket at every board meeting. I turned it over in my hand, and that's when I saw the engraving. "Truth endures." I sat down in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, and stared at that coin. It wasn't money. It was a message. Frank always believed the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how long people tried to bury it. I held the coin tight and whispered, "Ogeo, Frank, what did you leave me? What am I supposed to do?" But of course the room stayed silent. The old house had no answers, only echoes. I looked around at the shelves filled with his books and files. He'd been methodical his whole life, always planning, always thinking 3 steps ahead. If he left me this coin, it wasn't just sentiment. It meant there was more. I checked every drawer in the desk, ran my fingers along the wood edges, and finally found something strange. A small panel under the drawer that felt loose. When I pressed it, it slid open just enough to reveal a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It wasn't a letter, it was a single typed line, signed with his initials. "If you're reading this, you already know why. Start with the truth." That was all. No instructions, no explanations, just that. I leaned back in the chair, exhausted but alert. The truth. What truth? What did he mean? I glanced at the silver coin again, at the faint engraving under the light. Truth endures. Maybe that was his way of telling me to stop hiding, to use what I already had, the proof, the video, the truth of what really happened. Maybe the clause he mentioned wasn't just about business. Maybe it was about justice. As the day went on, the house grew quieter. I could hear footsteps somewhere downstairs, probably Sabrina's. She always moved like she was on stage, even when no one was watching. I stayed where I was, holding that coin, staring at the painting above the fireplace, the one of Frank standing by the river. His eyes in that portrait seemed to follow me. Frank had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone, even me. He planned this house, this company, this family's future, and now, I realized, he'd also planned for its fall. The only question left was whether he'd left me a weapon, or a test. I went to the office that night because I couldn't sleep and because staying in that house felt like waiting for a verdict in a trial I hadn't agreed to. The building was dark when I pulled into the lot, the street lamps throwing long, empty shadows across the pavement. Carter and coworkers had always looked solid to me, like something you could lean on, and standing there under those lights it looked small and fragile instead. I walked up to the glass doors and used the old key Frank had left for me, the one the board kept insisting was only symbolic, and the lock clicked like it always had. When I opened the door, the receptionist's desk was empty. the screensaver glowing quietly on a monitor, and there was that same hollow silence I'd felt in the house. The first thing I noticed was the wall where our family portraits used to hang, where once there had been a line of framed photos showing Frank in a hard hat, Frank at a book signing, all of us at openings and ribbon cuttings. Now there was a single corporate poster in their place. It was new, glossy, and perfectly staged, redefining legacy. The slogan Ryan had announced earlier at his press briefing. The poster showed a modern abstract chair and a tagline about future-focused design. My picture had been removed. The empty hooks looked like small mouths that had been shut. I moved through the showroom, past the samples and displays that used to feel like our living room, and now looked indistinguishable from a store. The lighting was cool and clinical. There were no signs of a celebration here, no warmth, just displays and price tags and a sense that someone had already tried to scrub the family out of the company's face. I felt my chest tighten the way it does when you see a loved one's handwriting crossed out on a will. I kept walking toward Frank's old office at the end of the corridor, where the door was still shut and where his portrait still hung, the one he always said made him look like a man who knew his work mattered. I pushed the door open and the room smelled like the cedar from his desk and the leather of his chair. His desk lamp cast a pool of light over scattered papers. Someone had ransacked the drawers. Things were out of place, files shuffled, a pen rolled across the blotter. But the safe behind the painting was still closed, and the painting still hung slightly crooked. I sat in his chair for a moment, feeling the weight of the leather under me, and I thought of how many times he'd sat there and looked out at the river, worrying about decisions that felt too big even for him. Then I stood up and checked my phone. No new messages, only the one from Daniel saying he'd meet me at the office and to be careful. When Daniel arrived, he moved quickly, the way lawyers do when a room contains a lot of meaning and too many people. He shut the door behind him, and for a minute we just listened to the building breathe. Then he said plainly, "They've been busy today. I watched the press conference." He slid a folder across the desk toward me, and inside were press clippings, contracts, and a clean, authoritative copy of the board's statement about restructuring. Ryan's face stared back at me from the articles, smiling for cameras to hide the way his hands must have been shaking. Daniel didn't waste words. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a plain manila envelope. "Frank gave me this," he said, handing it to me like it was something dangerous. My hands were still, but I felt the heat rise into my face as I took it. The envelope was old, the edges soft, and it bore Frank's handwriting across the flap. I sat back down and opened it. There were only 3 lines written on a single scrap of paper, in Frank's neat, typewritten script and his initials at the bottom. I read them twice, slowly, because they felt like the punchline to a joke only he and I had ever heard. "If they turn against you, the coin is your key. Trust Daniel. Remember, justice sleeps but never dies." At first the words were just words, but then I felt my throat close around something that wasn't air. The coin, the small silver dollar Frank used to keep in his pocket, suddenly felt heavy in my hand, as if I'd found it again right then. I remembered him tapping it before meetings, calling it his luck and his reminder to act honestly. I had that same coin in my bedside drawer, the one I took out the night he died. I hadn't thought about it as anything more than a keepsake until that moment. Daniel watched me with steady eyes and said, "It's not sentimental, Vivian. Frank was methodical. If he left this, it's because he expected this exact kind of betrayal." I told him the story of the coin, how he used it, how he joked about being 3 steps ahead, and how once, after a late night, he told me not to trust swift kindness. Daniel nodded, then he pulled a sheaf of documents from the folder and laid them out on the desk. Contracts, shareholder agreements, a version of the trust that had been redacted in places, signatures in blue and black ink. "The founder's clause exists," he said. Frank had a clause that activates under very specific circumstances. It was always part of the plan to protect your rights if the wrong hands tried to take control. The problem is it's not automatic. There are triggers and proofs you have to meet. He wanted the evidence to be bulletproof. I asked him, "What kind of proof?" And he said it quietly, the legal jargon made simple by the concern in his voice. "It has to be provable public humiliation or clear, demonstrable misuse of company power against you, carried out by someone in line to inherit. He designed it so it couldn't be overturned on a whim. He expected people would try to spin things, so he made his clause depend on facts, dates, recordings, and a legal chain of custody." My mind went straight back to Grace's video, to the red recording light blinking like a heartbeat on the screen. I told him about how Grace had filmed me falling and how Sabrina had smiled when it happened. I described the way Ryan stood there without moving. Daniel listened and then asked to see the recording, which I'd saved. He watched it once, twice, then leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "This is exactly the kind of thing Frank would have expected. If we can authenticate this file and establish it as undeniable proof, that could trigger the clause. But we'll need more than a single video. Metadata, witnesses, chain of custody, a board petition. It's a process." I felt that mix of cold and heat you get when a plan finds its first foothold. Part of me had wanted nothing more than to disappear after what happened, to nurse my hip and let time smooth over the shame. But something else, an old muscle memory, the one Frank and I had built through years of lining up beams and budgets and contractors, told me not to retreat. If proof was what he needed, then proof was what I would gather. Daniel laid out the steps in a frank, clinical way. We would need to preserve the original file, have it forensically verified, collect sworn statements from anyone who saw what happened, and formally notify the board that we intended to activate the clause. He warned me it would be messy, that there would be counterattacks, that Ryan and Sabrina had the resources to make this a public spectacle. He also said quietly and with the old private loyalty I had come to rely on, that he would stand by me. We went through the office, checking drawers and backups, looking for any legacy documents Frank might have left that referenced the clause. The IT server room hummed low and smelled faintly of ozone and coffee. The systems team had shut down certain file paths, but left logs intact. Daniel called in a favor with a tech he trusted and arranged for immediate forensic imaging of the original devices. We made copies, we documented, we labeled everything with the kind of obsessive care that comes from decades of running a business, where one wrong signature can cost you everything. When the night finally folded into the pale edges of dawn, I sat alone for a few minutes at Frank's desk with the coin in my hand and the 3-line note folded beside it. I thought about the years Frank and I had spent building a company from a single tiny workshop into what it was now, about the hires and the losses and the nights we argued about how to keep the business clean and steady. I thought about Ryan as a boy, the way he'd watched his father swing a hammer with a look of absolute trust in his eyes. I thought about the look on his face when he'd pushed me. Daniel's voice came back to me calm and certain. "If you want this, you need to wake justice yourself." I felt a strange steadiness settle in my. Fear and fury were there, but the loudest thing was a clear, hard focus. For 40 years, I had taught people how to build. That night, I understood I would have to teach them how to fall. I looked up at the painting of Frank against the river and told him, wordless and unshakable, that I was starting. Then I stood, gathered the copies we'd made, and walked out into the cool dawn with the coin in my pocket and a plan beginning to take shape. The first article came out 3 days after Daniel and I met in the office. It was short, almost polite, with a headline that read, "Former Carter Director Exhibits Concerning Behavior Following Retirement." The tone was careful, but the implication was clear. They were planting seeds, doubts about my sanity, about my stability, about whether what happened that night had even happened at all. By the end of the week, there were 5 more. One said I'd been confused during a board meeting months ago. Another quoted a source close to the family claiming I'd been under medication and prone to outbursts. They called me unstable, emotional, and unfit to manage corporate responsibilities. The last one was the cruelest. It ran with a picture of me and Frank taken 20 years ago, cropped so that he looked alive and strong and I looked like a shadow. The headline read, "Is the Carter matriarch losing touch with reality?" I didn't have to guess where it came from. Patricia Moore, Sabrina's mother, had been waiting for this. Patricia was the kind of woman who smiled with all her teeth and never wasted time being subtle. She had contacts in local media, friends on every social committee in Charleston, and a lifetime of gossip polished into strategy. It wasn't enough that her daughter married into my family. She wanted her daughter to own it. And tearing me down was the easiest way to make that happen. Within days, reporters started showing up outside the gate. The long driveway that used to feel private now felt like a stage. They waited by the entrance, pretending to check their phones, their cameras ready. One morning, as I stepped out to collect the mail, a woman with a microphone leaned over the fence and shouted, "Mrs. Carter, do you have any comment about the allegations?" I stopped, looked at her, and said quietly, "I'm not losing my mind. I'm losing my faith." Then I turned around and walked back inside. That was all they needed. By afternoon, the quote was everywhere, stripped of context, turned into another headline. Carter matriarch admits losing control. Inside the house, I felt the weight of it all pressing down. The phones kept ringing. Strangers left messages filled with pity, others with anger. Some offered prayers, others insults. It was like the world had been invited to watch me unravel. Grace saw it happening. She stopped going to school for a few days, staying by my side instead. She tried to help with the calls, with the letters, with the endless stream of questions. But she's 16, too young to carry this kind of ugliness. One night she came into my room holding her phone, her eyes red from crying. "Grandma," she said, "they're lying about you. Everyone's saying you made it up, that Dad didn't push you, that it was an accident." She paused, shaking. "But I have the video, the whole thing. I kept it." I looked at her then and saw something new. Not the shy girl who used to braid my hair, but someone older, stronger, angry in a way I recognized. "Grace," I said gently, "don't get involved. They'll come after you, too." She looked right back at me. "Then let them. The truth's already out there." I wanted to tell her to stay quiet, to wait until Daniel and I could finish preparing the legal proof, to let the lawyers handle it. But there's a moment when silence feels like surrender, and she saw it in my face. That night, she uploaded the video. The caption was simple. My grandma was pushed at Christmas. She didn't tag anyone, didn't say a name, didn't even show her face. Just the footage, the table, the laughter, Ryan's voice, the shove, the sound of glass breaking, the camera shaking as she screamed. No edits, no filters, no music, just truth. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By morning, it was trending. People shared it with comments like, "I can't believe this happened," and "that poor woman." Within 48 hours, the video hit 1 million views. News outlets started calling again, but this time they weren't asking if I was losing my mind. They were asking if I wanted to give a statement. Ryan and Sabrina must have seen it at the same time everyone else did. Patricia, too. I could imagine her pacing her kitchen, her phone lighting up with calls from the same reporters she'd once fed. The tone had shifted, the whisper campaign had turned against them. Now the whispers were about abuse, betrayal, family greed. Grace sat on the couch beside me, scrolling through the comments. Some were cruel, of course. The internet always has those, but most were kind. People said they believed me. Some shared their own stories about being mistreated by their children or losing control of something they built. Others just said, "Stay strong, Grandma." I didn't know how to feel. The attention made me uneasy. But watching Grace's face light up, I understood something. She had done what I couldn't. She had turned the silence into sound. That night, Daniel called. His voice was steady but more urgent than usual. "The video changes everything," he said. "It's proof and it's public. They can't bury this now." "But they'll try," I said. "They will," he agreed, "but we'll be ready." When I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard. The reporters were gone. For the first time in days, the gate was empty. The night air was still. Inside, Grace sat on the couch, her phone glowing in the dark as she answered messages from strangers telling her how brave she was. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't have to be brave, that this wasn't her fight, but I also knew that without her, I'd still be trapped in their version of the story. Frank used to say, "The truth only matters if someone's willing to speak it out loud." Grace had done that, not with anger or revenge, but with honesty. The house felt lighter somehow, even if just for a moment. The walls that had held so much silence now held something else. Noise, truth, resistance. I sat beside her and watched the video again. The sound of the glass breaking still made my stomach twist, but I didn't look away. As I watched, I thought about the claws, about Frank's words, about justice sleeping until someone wakes it. Maybe this was how it started. Not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a 16-year-old girl's hands, through a small screen held steady by courage. When the video ended, Grace turned to me. "What happens now?" she asked. I smiled, though my throat felt tight. "Now," I said, "we wait, and we watch who starts talking. Because justice, once it starts moving, never sleeps again." When Grace's video passed 1 million views, it felt like a door had opened. Not just in this house, but in the entire world. Within 24 hours, the clip had spread across every platform. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of them filled with one phrase that kept repeating, "Jar justice for Vivian." At first, I didn't even understand what a hashtag could do. I had lived long enough to see fads come and go, but this was different. This wasn't gossip whispered behind backs. This was public, relentless, and impossible to erase. People were angry, not just for me, but for what I represented. Mothers who were discarded, women who had been told they were too old to matter. The news picked it up. Morning talk shows debated it between segments about politics and celebrity gossip. A headline on CNN read, "Was the Carter heir abusive?" Someone found an old photo of Ryan at a charity event and posted it next to a screenshot from the video, the one where his hand shoved forward where the glass shattered. It went viral again. Sabrina tried to control the damage first. She went on television, sitting perfectly poised in a cream-colored suit, her makeup flawless, her voice calm. "Grace manipulated the footage," she said. "It's been taken out of context. My mother-in-law fell accidentally. We love her and we're concerned about her well-being." She managed to sound sincere and heartbroken, like she was the victim. I watched it from the couch with Grace beside me. I didn't get angry, I just felt tired. Then Patricia appeared, standing beside Ryan during a press conference outside the Carter and Cumber building. She wore black and carried a tissue, her voice trembling as she told the cameras, "This has been devastating for our family. We hope Mrs. Carter gets the help she needs." She dabbed at tears that never fell. Ryan stood stiffly beside her, his jaw tight, eyes darting to the cameras, like a man trying to memorize his own lie. By evening, the internet had turned into a battlefield. Supporters of the family's version clashed with strangers defending me. People picked apart every frame of Grace's video. Some claimed to see manipulation. Others pointed out the reflections in the glass, the audio, the way the room reacted. Amateur analysts slowed the footage down to prove it wasn't fake. It became a public trial. The comments grew cruel. Grace started receiving messages that made her cry. Threats, accusations, endless strangers telling her she destroyed her own family. One afternoon, she came into my room shaking, holding her phone. "They're saying I did it for money, Grandma," she said. "They're saying you told me to fake it." I took the phone from her hand, turned it off, and pulled her into my arms. "Listen to me," I said quietly. "They can break stories, not souls. We know the truth. That's enough." She didn't answer, but I felt her nod against my shoulder. Meanwhile, Daniel called every day. He was methodical, keeping track of what the company's legal team was doing, what statements were being released. "Public opinion is the court you didn't plan to enter, Vivian," he told me, "but you're winning it." He wasn't wrong. Carter and Cobers began losing contracts. One of their biggest investors pulled out, citing ethical concerns. Another client announced they were freezing all joint projects until internal matters were clarified. In less than a week, Ryan's perfect world started to crack. News outlets began digging deeper. They unearthed details about questionable transactions under Sabrina's department, whispered stories of misused funds. The image of the perfect couple, young, driven, progressive, started to crumble. Every time Sabrina appeared on TV, new comments flooded in calling her cold, calculating, the smile behind the fall. At home, I watched all of this unfold from the same chair by the window where I used to read with Frank. The house that had been so quiet now buzzed with phone calls, notifications, and reporters outside the gate. Grace barely left my side. Daniel came by more often, working from my dining table, surrounded by printouts, legal drafts, and his ever-present coffee cup. Then, one afternoon, we saw a video leaked from inside Carter & Co. It showed Sabrina in her office, slamming a stack of papers against the wall. She shouted at Ryan, "You ruined everything with that stupid old woman." The clip cut off there, but it was enough. The world didn't need context anymore. The facade was gone. That night, the company's board held an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but Daniel was. He called me afterward and said quietly, "They're losing control. 2 sponsors have withdrawn. Ryan's being pressured to step down until the situation is resolved." Ryan must have known the walls were closing in because 2 days later he tried to reach me. He sent a message through Grace. No apology, just a request to meet. I didn't respond. There would be a time for words, but not yet. Grace, however, wasn't finished. She came to me holding her phone again. "There's another part of the video," she said. I didn't post it before because I thought it was too sad. I frowned, unsure what she meant. She pressed play. The new clip began right after the fall. The camera had kept rolling while everyone stood still. It showed me standing up, straightening my dress, wiping the red wine from my sleeve and saying, "Let's continue." You could hear someone laugh, a nervous, guilty laugh, before the video ended. Grace uploaded it without a caption, just silence. Within hours, the new clip exploded. 10 million views. People wrote things like, "That's dignity." She stood up, literally. Others posted the two videos together, the fall and the recovery, with the words, "She didn't break." The image, spread like wildfire, screenshots of me standing, the spilled wine like a stain of proof beside me. By the next morning, talk shows weren't asking, "Was she pushed?" anymore. They were asking, "How could a son do this?" News anchors replayed the clips side by side. Psychologists discussed family betrayal on live television. Commentators called me the face of quiet strength. Some went too far, turning it into something symbolic. Every mother who's ever been erased. I didn't like that. I wasn't a symbol. I was just someone who refused to disappear. Ryan and Sabrina disappeared from the public eye for a few days. Patricia stopped answering calls. Carter and Coper issued a brief statement about internal restructuring and commitment to transparency. Everyone could see what that meant. Daniel showed up at my door that evening, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since Frank's funeral. "It's turning," he said simply. "Public sentiment, financial pressure, everything. You don't need to fight alone anymore. The world saw it." I looked at Grace, sitting quietly with her phone in her lap, and I thought of Frank, his coin, his message, his faith in truth. He used to say justice sleeps but never dies. Maybe this was what he meant. Not a courtroom, not a contract, but this, the light of a million screens forcing the dark to show its face. As night fell, I stood by the window again. Outside, reporters gathered, their cameras glowing like fireflies. The air felt heavy with something new. Not fear, but exposure. Once the world sees, it can't unsee. Grace joined me and slipped her hand into mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because in that moment I knew the tide had shifted. The whispers had become noise. The noise had become truth. And when the world finally saw what they'd done, there was nowhere left for them to hide. Daniel was the one who said the name first. We were sitting in my living room, surrounded by printouts, folders, and the faint smell of old paper and coffee. He was talking about how the board was tightening their defenses, how Ryan had hired a new legal team, and how Carter and Kofor was using its own funds to fight me. Then he said quietly, "There's one man who can match their resources, Victor Langston." I froze. That name hadn't been spoken in this house in decades. Frank and Victor had been rivals, though not enemies. They competed for the same contracts, the same clients, even the same reputation. Frank always said Victor was brilliant but ruthless. "He doesn't just build," Frank once told me. "He conquers." I hadn't seen Victor in more than 20 years. The thought of meeting him again brought back too many memories, some professional, some personal, all complicated. I looked at Daniel and said, "You think he'd help me?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Help you? Maybe. Help himself? Definitely. But that's the kind of alliance that wins wars." A week later, I found myself in a car heading downtown, the silver coin in my pocket like a heartbeat. The city was waking up, glass towers reflecting the morning light, people in suits carrying coffees, cars honking. Daniel didn't say much on the way there. He just looked out the window, his jaw tight. When we pulled up to Langston Holdings, I understood why Frank had called Victor ruthless. The building looked like power, all steel and glass, sharp edges and reflections. Victor's office was on the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by silence, polished marble, and a panoramic view of the harbor. His assistant let us in, and there he was, standing by the window with a cup of espresso in one hand, looking exactly like he had 20 years ago. Silver hair, perfect suit, calm eyes that missed nothing. "Vivian Carter," he said, turning toward me. "It's been a long time." "Too long," I replied, though my voice came out steadier than I felt. He gestured toward the seats across from his desk. "I heard about the video, about your son. The whole world has." I nodded. "Then you know why I'm here?" He studied me for a moment, then said slowly, "Do you want revenge or do you want justice?" The question hung in the air. I thought about it, really thought about it. About the nights I'd sat awake replaying the fall, the laughter, the silence, about the humiliation, about Grace, her courage, her pain. Then I said, "Justice leaves no ash." Victor smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "Good answer. Frank would have liked that." He sat down, motioned for Daniel and me to do the same, and opened a folder that had been waiting on his desk. "I've kept an eye on Carter and Co.," he said. "Your son and his wife have done impressive damage in a short amount of time. They've lost investors, broken contracts, and burned every bridge they built. The company's stock value has dropped 15% since the video went viral. They're bleeding, Vivian, but they still have money. They still have lawyers. You'll need more than truth to win. You'll need muscle. I leaned forward. And you're offering that? He nodded. I'll fund your case, cover every legal expense, hire the best forensic accountants, even bring in PR specialists to manage the noise. You'll have everything you need to take back the company and your name. In return, if you win, I get first rights to purchase controlling shares of Carter & Co. at market value. No tricks, just business. Daniel looked uneasy. That's a steep price, Victor. Victor shrugged. Fair trade. I provide the ammunition, she pulls the trigger. I didn't respond right away. I looked around the office, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the spotless glass, the precise arrangement of everything. It was so different from Frank's study, cluttered with papers and sketches, full of life and mess. This room was sterile, efficient, soulless. Victor had built his empire by erasing sentiment. Maybe that's why he'd survived when others hadn't. I asked him, why help me at all? You could sit back and watch us destroy each other. He chuckled softly. Because I respect what Frank built. And because, Vivian, your son and his wife have been calling my clients, trying to lure them away with discounts and promises. They made it personal. You're not the only one they've wronged. I felt something shift inside me. Not trust, but understanding. He wasn't doing this out of kindness. He was doing it because it served him. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. I stood up. You'll get your empire, I said. I'll get my piece. He extended his hand across the table. Then we have a deal? His handshake was firm, steady, cold. The kind of handshake that sealed fates, not just contracts. As we left, Daniel looked at me carefully. You know what you're doing, right? I do, I said. Frank used to say sometimes you have to build a bridge with borrowed hands. This is one of those times. Daniel nodded but didn't look convinced. Just remember, Victor never does anything without a price. I know, I replied, but neither do I. Back home, I sat in Frank's old chair with the coin between my fingers. Its surface was smooth, the engraving still faintly visible. Truth endures. I thought about that, about what truth costs, about what it gives back. Maybe it doesn't come free. Maybe it never did. The next morning, Daniel called to confirm the first transfers. Lawyers were hired, accounts were opened, and paperwork started to move faster than I could keep track of. For the first time in weeks, I felt momentum. A storm was forming, and I wasn't running from it anymore. I was walking, straight into it. Later that afternoon, Grace asked if everything was going to be okay. She'd heard me on the phone, heard the words court filing and petition. I smiled at her and said, "We're just setting things right, sweetheart." She frowned. "With that man? The one who doesn't smile?" I laughed softly. "Yes, that one. He's helping us in his own way." "Can you trust him?" she asked. "No," I said honestly. "But that's the point." Grace looked confused, but she didn't ask again. She just nodded like she was learning something new about the world, about how sometimes the people who help you aren't the ones you like, but the ones who have something to gain from seeing justice done. That night, as I walked through the quiet house, I thought of Frank again. He'd always said the hardest part of building anything wasn't the work. It was the alliances. You never built anything alone. You always needed others, even the ones you'd rather not stand beside. Now I understood. They called it a special hearing, but everyone knew it was a trial. The Carter and Comber board had gathered inside the Grand Council chamber at Charleston City Hall, a building that smelled of old wood, power, and politics. The white overhead lights were harsh, almost surgical. Reporters lined the back of the room, cameras flashing, microphones waiting. This wasn't just business anymore. It was spectacle. Sabrina stood at the center table in a white suit so pristine it looked like armor. Her hair was perfect, her smile controlled. She whispered to Ryan beside her, who was pale but trying to look composed. He adjusted his tie and tapped the microphone. "Carter & Co. stands for integrity and innovation," he began. "We have faced challenges before, but our family's legacy has always been rooted in progress and resilience. I'm confident that..." The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Every head turned. I stepped inside. Gray suit, silver hair pinned neatly. My cane tapped lightly against the marble floor. In my left hand, I held the small silver coin Frank had given me decades ago, the one engraved with "Truth Endures." The room went silent except for the faint clicks of camera shutters. Someone near the back whispered, "It's her." Another voice murmured, "The video woman." I walked to the front, past the rows of board members and spectators. Ryan's face drained of color. Sabrina stiffened, her hand clutching her folder a little too tightly. "Good morning," I said calmly. I wasn't sure I'd be invited to my own company's funeral. Daniel followed close behind me, briefcase in hand. He placed a small USB drive on the polished oak table. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice steady, "the board deserves to see the truth in full." Ryan laughed nervously. "What is this? Another performance?" Daniel ignored him and plugged in the drive. The giant screen behind the council flickered to life. For a moment it showed a frozen frame, the dining room at Christmas, the warm lights, the tree, the table. Then the video played. My voice. Ryan's voice. The argument, the push, the glass shattering, the silence after. The sound of my fall echoed through the chamber. You could hear a pin drop. On screen, I lay on the marble floor, stunned, humiliated. Behind me, Sabrina's faint smirk appeared for less than a second. But it was enough. The camera zoomed in on her expression, frozen mid-smile. When the video ended, the screen went black. Ryan stood up suddenly, his chair screeching. "That was edited," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "You think people can't fake videos these days? This is... Daniel didn't flinch. "We have the raw file, complete with metadata verified by an independent digital forensics lab. Every timestamp, every frame, every pixel matches. You can check it yourself." The room erupted into whispers. Board members turned to one another, some leaning in, others shaking their heads. A journalist in the back scribbled furiously in a notebook. The hum of tension grew until it broke into silence again. I stepped forward, the sound of my heels slow and deliberate. Then I placed the coin, the old silver piece, in the center of the table. Its soft metallic ring carried through the quiet like a bell. This, I said, was Frank's. He called it his truth coin, and he built this company on that same truth. The founder's clause, which my husband wrote into our charter, states that any act of aggression or proven harm against the founder or their legacy voids all inheritance and leadership rights. That clause was meant to protect not just a company, but a name, our name. I looked at Ryan. My husband believed in grace. I believe in accountability. Sabrina slammed her hands on the table. "You can't do this," she screamed. "This is a setup. You're manipulating everyone." I didn't raise my voice. "I already did, the day you chose greed over gratitude." Ryan opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. He looked smaller somehow, deflated, like a boy caught in a lie too big to explain. One of the senior board members, an older man with a deep southern drawl, cleared his throat. "Madam Chair," he said to the interim moderator, "I think we've seen enough. Let's vote." Hands rose one by one. No hesitation, no debate. Every single member voted in my favor. The room filled with murmurs, then applause. Flashbulbs went off like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. "Mrs. Carter, how does it feel to regain control? Will you press charges? Do you forgive your son?" I ignored them all. I turned to Ryan, who sat motionless, staring at the coin on the table. "You wanted a new era," I said softly. "Well, here it is." He didn't respond. Sabrina tried to pull him to his feet, but he stayed seated, his hands trembling. Patricia wasn't there. She disappeared days ago, her phone disconnected. Daniel leaned toward me. "It's done," he whispered. "You're back." But I didn't feel triumphant. The cheers, the flashes, the victory, none of it filled the hollow space that had grown inside me since that night. I had won, yes. But the cost was written all over Ryan's face, in the ruin of what used to be a family. As the session adjourned, I gathered the coin and slipped it back into my pocket. Reporters followed me out, their questions blending into a meaningless hum. Outside, the air was bright and sharp, the wind lifting my hair as the city buzzed with the breaking story. Daniel walked beside me in silence. Grace was waiting at the car, her eyes bright with both pride and worry. She handed me her phone. My name was trending again. This time not as a victim, but as something else entirely. Vivian Carter reclaims Carter and Costanza. Didn't smile. I just exhaled and looked up at the sky. "Frank," I whispered under my breath. "We did it." Then, after a pause, I added quietly, "But it doesn't feel like winning." Because it wasn't just a company I had reclaimed that day. It was something deeper, something older. My name, my dignity, my place in the world. It happened faster than I expected, not the justice, but the silence that followed it. Once the board vote was public, the dominoes started to fall one after another. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, inevitable. Patricia Moore was the first. Within a week, she was removed from her post as a political advisor after leaked emails showed she'd used her influence to manipulate media coverage in Sabrina's favor. The same reporters who once called her the power behind Charleston's modern image now wrote headlines like "The Fall of the Queenmaker." She disappeared from the social circuit overnight, her name scrubbed from the charity board she'd once ruled. Sabrina followed soon after. The financial investigation that Daniel predicted came true. Forensic accountants traced misused company funds and questionable transfers tied to her signature. The news networks that used to praise her modern leadership now ran endless clips of her angry outburst at the council meeting. She stopped showing up in public altogether. The last I heard, she'd hired a crisis PR firm and was fighting to stay out of court. And Ryan, my son, wasn't spared either. The board froze his assets. Creditors called in their loans. He sold his house, then the vacation property, then the cars. Every photo of him that once appeared on glossy business covers now surfaced again under headlines about failure and betrayal. It wasn't vengeance, it was gravity. They had set everything in motion the day they decided that greed was worth more than grace. I saw Ryan for the first time in months one gray afternoon. He came to the house unannounced, thinner, quieter, holding himself like someone who had been living under rain for too long. I found him standing in the foyer, looking at the framed family photo that Grace had rehung on the wall, the one they'd once removed. His eyes lingered on Frank's face for a long time before he turned to me. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice cracked a little, like it used to when he was a boy and couldn't admit he'd broken something. I stood there looking at him. There was a part of me that wanted to forgive, that wanted to reach out. But the truth was, forgiveness isn't something you say. It's something you earn, one small choice at a time. "I hope you say it to the mirror every morning," I told him quietly. He nodded, swallowed hard, and left. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, he walked away without looking back. Not long after, I met with Victor again, this time not as an adversary, but as an equal. His office looked the same, glass, steel, order. Only this time, I didn't feel out of place. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You've got what you wanted. What now?" I placed a folder on the table. "The sale agreement," I said. "You'll get Carter and co-owners at market value as promised. But there's one condition." He raised an eyebrow. I should have known. I slid the next page toward him. "You'll create a new foundation, the Carter Artisanship Fund. It will train and support young craftsmen, designers, and builders who want to work with their hands, the way Frank once did. No corporate gloss, no greed. Just skill and integrity. That's my price." Victor read the clause silently, then smiled faintly. "You're still negotiating, even when you're giving things away." "Old habits," I said. He signed the papers without hesitation. "Congratulations, Vivian. You built something that will outlive all of us." When I left his office, the city was bathed in evening light, warm and gold against the glass towers. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I was walking toward peace. Back home, Grace waited for me on the porch. She had her camera again, not to record, but to take a photo. "One last one, Grandma," she said, smiling. I stood by the roses Frank had planted years ago and let her capture the moment, an old woman, tired but unbroken, standing where it all began. Later that night, as I sat by the window with the silver coin in my hand, I realized the truth. I hadn't won to humiliate them. I hadn't fought to prove I was right. I fought so they'd understand what loss really meant. Not money, not power, but losing what you can never buy back: respect, legacy, trust. Frank once said that real victories leave no celebration, only quiet clarity. He was right. A year has passed. The world moved on. The headlines faded, the noise dimmed, and I did too. I live now in a small house by the sea at the edge of Kiowa Island. The locals call this stretch of sand Lavender Shore because every evening when the sun begins to set, the sky turns the color of lilacs and bruised seashells. It's quiet here, but not empty. The silence feels earned. Most mornings begin the same way. Grace wakes first, her hair tied in a messy bun, hands already covered in clay. She's taken up pottery, says it makes her feel calm, centered. The garage has become her studio, filled with half-finished bowls, cups, and sculptures. I sometimes catch her humming while she works, the same melody Frank used to whistle while sanding wood. Leo, one of the scholarship students from the new Carter Artisanship Fund, comes by twice a week. He's 22, tall, shy, and brilliant with his hands. He works on the porch, carving small wooden boats and furniture legs. The rhythmic sound of his knife against wood mixes with the waves outside. It's music in its own way, the sound of creation instead of destruction. And me? I make tea. Every morning, 2 cups, one for me, one for Frank. Old habits die softly here. The house smells of salt and clay and chamomile. The air is warm, the light kind. It's not the life I once had. It's smaller, simpler, but it's mine. One morning, as Grace shaped clay on her wheel, she asked without looking up, "Grandma, do you miss them?" I paused. The question wasn't sharp. It was tender, curious, like a child peeking into a closed room. I poured another cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward. "Love doesn't vanish," I said finally. "It just changes address." Grace smiled softly. "So, you still love Dad?" I nodded. "Always. But love doesn't mean staying. Sometimes it means letting people live with what they've done, and still wishing them peace." She didn't answer, just kept shaping the clay, her movements slower, more thoughtful. A seagull cried somewhere outside. Leo looked up from his carving and said almost shyly, "That's beautiful, Mrs. Carter." I smiled. "It's just life, Leo. We don't stop loving, we just learn new ways to carry it." Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk facing the open window. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, the horizon painted in lavender light. I took out a piece of stationery and began writing a letter. Not typed, not formal, just a few lines in my handwriting. "Dear Daniel, it's been a year since the council meeting. The company is doing well under Victor's guidance, better than I expected. The fund is growing. Grace says we've already helped 12 young artisans start their own workshops. I think Frank would have been proud. I thought peace meant silence, but it doesn't. Peace has its own sounds, waves, laughter, wood being carved, the turning of clay. I found peace, not silence. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself. Vivian." I sealed the envelope and placed it by the window, where the breeze would dry the ink. As the sun sank lower, I walked out to the porch. Grace had lined up her finished bowls, small, imperfect, each one unique. Leo was cleaning his tools. The sea glowed lavender and gold. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel haunted by what happened. Justice had done its part, clean, final, necessary, but what remained was softer, quieter, the part that belonged not to law or proof, but to the heart. Frank once told me that houses remember everything, every laugh, every tear, every word said in anger or in love. Maybe that's true, but this new house didn't know my pain yet. It only knew my peace. Grace handed me one of her cups, still warm from the kiln. "For you, Grandma. It's not perfect, but it's beautiful," I said. "Nothing perfect ever tells the whole story." We sat there together, the 3 of us. One building, one carving, one remembering. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. And as the sky deepened into its soft lavender, I realized that this quiet, imperfect, honest life was the truest ending I could have asked for. It was Grace who found the chair. She'd been rummaging through the old storage shed one afternoon, looking for more wood for her pottery shelves, when she called out, "Grandma, you need to see this." I stepped outside, the air smelling of salt and seagrass, and there it was, covered in dust, the paint long faded, one leg cracked but still standing. The rose chair. Frank's chair. The one that used to sit at the head of our dining table. The same chair Ryan had once pushed me away from. For a long time, I just stood there staring at it. The carved rose on the backrest was still visible beneath the worn paint. Grace looked at me, unsure if she'd done the right thing. "Should I put it back?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, bring it here." We carried it out to the porch together, the same porch where we watched the ocean every evening. The wood was rough against my palms, but familiar. When we set it down, the sea breeze lifted the curtain of dust into the light. "It's still strong," Grace said, crouching beside it. "It just needs a little care." For the next few days, she worked on it after her pottery sessions, sanding the edges, filling the cracks, repainting it in soft ivory. She left the carved rose unpainted, the bare wood showing through like a heartbeat beneath the surface. When she finished, she smiled shyly and said, "It's yours again." That evening, as the sun began to set, I brought out a pot of tea and sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath me, the wood settling like it remembered me. The ocean shimmered lavender and gold. Grace sat on the steps beside me, Leo leaned against the railing, and for a long time none of us spoke. The air smelled of sea salt and wet wood. The sound of waves came slow and steady, like breathing. I traced my fingers along the carved rose, feeling the grooves Frank had once made with his knife. It wasn't perfect. The petals were uneven, the lines shaky, but it was real. It was his. Grace looked up at me and said, "It suits you better here than at that old table." I smiled. Maybe it was always meant to end up here. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened. The wind, the sea, Grace's laughter somewhere behind me. I thought of everything that had happened. The fall, the fight, the noise, the silence after justice. It all felt distant now, like another life lived by another woman. In the end, all that remained was this. Peace. Not victory, not revenge, just peace. The camera would pull back slowly, first showing my hands resting gently on the carved rose, then my face in the soft light of sunset, calm and steady. And then, over that quiet image, the final words would play in voiceover. They pushed me from my seat. But now, I sit where peace is the only crown. The frame would widen, the porch, the house, the horizon, until the sea filled everything. The water turned lavender under the last light of day, rippling like silk, endless and forgiving, and then fade out.